emitters at all costs. And it has worked incredibly well, repeatedly. Plants seem to love it, and it just seems to be as close to the ecosystem as we can get it. Yeah? Anybody else?
One last thing. Part of the question addressed diseases. So I can pretty much say that the overhead watering is not going to be necessarily the cause of the disease. What we always want to do is identify what the disease is and what plant that disease is on, and then from there we can talk about what's going on with that equation. So it's not necessarily going to be because of overhead watering.
Okay, let's move on to soils. It sort of seemed like Aristotle was fire, earth, air, and water, right? Okay, so there's an interesting comment I know that Greg made about how native plants don't normally need any soil amendments. But we're thinking about how we have the situations in native chaparral, woodland, forest ecosystems where there's a long history of natural development of mycorrhizae and the whole soil profile. What about our urban or suburban situations where we don't have that history? How do we get mycorrhizae into our soil? How do we know it's there? Is there some type of heavy, inorganic, chemical intensive soil preparation that we should do?
Is there a missing step?
Huh? Yeah, there might be some. Anyways.
Yes, there's definitely ways to introduce can you hear me? Sorry. Yes, there's definitely ways to introduce the mycorrhizae into your soil that are organic and that without having to use any of the heavy fertilizers. It can be either by just getting the microorganisms, or you can do just compost. Like just having even just making your own compost at home. If you have, I live in San Francisco, I have a very small space, but I have a warm compost bin, so all of my food scraps go in there, and that is just filled with all kinds of microorganisms that then I put in the soil, and that builds the soil without really having to use any heavy chemicals. Again, I'll just put it again, P, it's great, fertilizer. So, yeah, but there's no need to put any chemicals in your landscape. It can all be done organically, even in the city. Like, I have a beautiful garden in my apartment in the middle of San Francisco. It's just filled with flowers right now. It's really incredible, and no chemicals have been used.
Just because something's in the city doesn't necessarily mean that it's in worse shape too than something that's in a suburban or a rural area. Actually, I think there was a study in Manhattan a couple of years ago. They did some soil sampling in Central Park, and they found incredible biodiversity there. And all the soil scientists were blown away. They did not expect to find this kind of diversity in the middle of Manhattan. And then, conversely, you can go out to the middle of Iowa and find things that are completely devoid of nutrients. And some of what's happening is that the plants that are chosen to be planted, if you're planting a monoculture, then you're just effectively giving whatever is living in the soil the same thing to eat 24/7. And one of the themes that's emerged today is having this complexity and this biodiversity, and nature wants complexity, it needs complexity, it builds and it tends towards complexity. So you get that complexity by having a variety of different plants, right, in your garden that will put those exudates out, that will attract the right kind of biology in your soil ecosystem.
So if you're wondering how you get that fairly quickly, if you've got native plants that you want to introduce mycorrhizae for, just go out into nature and find a stand of those native plants out there. Grab some duff, put in a little cup or something like that. That cup is going to contain millions of spores of those mycorrhizal fungi, and you can simply sprinkle a little bit of that around your plant. You will inoculate your soil with those very mycorrhizal organisms that the plant has evolved with. So that's, and the next thing I want to sort of, forgive me, I'll try and keep this short. I've got a little bit of a problem with packaged mycorrhizae because remember when we went through and we were talking about insects earlier in this conference, and we were sitting down saying, yeah, we may not actually know all the insects that are even out there. Trust me, insects are really easy to find and categorize compared to subterranean fungi. So we, at best, probably only know 80% of the fungi that are out there in our soils of California. And for other parts of the world, that's probably as low as 20% of the ones we know. Got a little bit of a problem with bringing in exotic mycorrhizae, picking it out of a package, sticking it in the ground and putting it in. Because one of the problems we've had with native plants here is that we're bringing in all these exotics and putting, we can't even tell you what we're losing in terms of native mycorrhizae because we don't even know what we have. So I would encourage you to go out and just grab a handful of stuff, put it in your garden that matches the biome that you're trying to emulate in that garden, and it'll sort itself out.
Real quick, yeah, we don't inoculate. In fact, mycorrhizal spore is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. We have the same concerns about introducing foreign spore, and if you have a well-grown native plant in a pot that's healthy, a lot of the time that actually becomes the inoculum for your site when you plant it. Okay, and it moves out about 3 to 6 feet a year as it goes. So typically, even in really crappy, in fact, I love subgraded soil because there's no weeds and there's no pathogens. So we dig a hole, stick it in, they do fine. Natives are adapted, amazing that way.
Okay, there's another very interesting question here that I think I'm going to take because I think it deserves some good attention. It's what part of California's biodiversity is made up of invasive plants? And I think we have to go back and really define the two terms maybe a little better. Biological diversity has many components. So there's the number of species. There's also the evenness of the species. All have to be present in healthy populations to have a diverse a high measure of biodiversity. And then also there's genetic diversity, goes on and on and on. So then there's also invasive. Not all non-native plants, which are often called exotic plants, are invasive. The term invasive means that a particular species is spreading at the expense of others. So
Humans.
When we talk about biological diversity of California, if we want to have a high biological diversity of California, we want many species. We also want their populations to be healthy enough so that some of them are not on the verge of extinction. And then we also can say that we can add other species which may add to our richness, which is the total number of species. But if they become invasive and start crowding out other species, we're going to lower diversity because the populations of the other species are going to decrease, and then we may lose some of the native species to extinction. So it's a very interesting question. Thanks for who put this down here. And we have to say that a lot of the introduced plants can provide certain habitat value for native species, but they're often the generalist species. So Art Shapiro, who's a lepidopterist up at UC Davis, published a very interesting paper about how many of the butterflies in the city of Davis were subsisting on introduced plants. And then you just have to remember that butterflies, those particular butterflies that he was mentioning, are the generalist feeders. They're not restricted to one species of plant. But there are a lot of species of butterflies and moths and many other insects that are restricted to one species of plant. So it's a very complex picture, but generally we would say that invasive plants tend to decrease the biological diversity of California rather than increase it. Okay, anybody else?
Brilliant. Yeah, I think
Okay, all right. Okay, then. Okay, Linda, what about your question? So this actually gets back to the last question. Maybe I should have piggybacked on the last question. If an oak tree has armillaria, and the arborist recommends a fungicide, are there alternatives? So we know that fungicides in general can tend to hurt the soil microflora, okay? And we also know that we have several problems. I mean, you mentioned armillaria, we also have of course, sudden death, Phytophthora. Are there some of these treatments that could actually hurt the soil, and are there some alternatives?
I'll start. Okay, so there are no known chemical treatments for armillaria, so that's just going to be right off the bat. There are treatments for armillaria, but the treatments for armillaria, for the most part, involve, it's a little bit complicated, but it involves using an air spade or something else that simply picks up the soil, gently moves it away from the root system, dries everything out, and interrupts the mycelial network that armillaria uses. So armillaria is the biggest armillaria infections are miles wide. It is moving nutrients through the soil, moving nutrients from a dead stump to go overwhelm the host defenses of a living stump someplace else, or a living tree someplace else. So if you can interrupt those mycelial highways, then you can interrupt armillaria's ability to attack another tree. So that's one of the major reasons you're simply blowing